He, like many people in the Bengals community, predicted that the Bengals would have kind of more of an average year and finish the year at 8-9. Surprise! They're in the Super Bowl now. Welcome to the jungle, Bengals fans. I'm Kyle Phelps, and who saw this video coming, man? With the Bengals having a bye week before the Super Bowl, I figured I'd go back and look at what some of the experts and some of my favorite talking heads were saying about the Bengals heading into the 2021 season. Spoiler alert, almost none of it was positive. Before we get into that though, I'd just like to ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the content. It really helps my channel out and it helps you to be the first to know when we put out awesome videos just like this one. The off season is almost here, so my schedule is going to be a little bit more fluid after this. But you're not going to want to miss the Super Bowl preview show we got coming out on Friday with a new member of our excellent team of correspondents. We'll also have a Super Bowl recap next Monday. And don't forget about the Battle of Ohio podcast clips that we always come out with twice a week. Those will be continuing throughout the offseason, unlike obviously previews and recaps, which are only going to happen, during the season when there are games to preview and recap. But other than that, we're going to be having, some videos coming out like once a week or so on NFL topics that I find interesting, as well as videos on Bengals offseason topics in particular. Those aren't necessarily going to come out every single week, but I'm definitely going to be putting a lot of effort into them. So like I said, subscribe and you won't miss any of it. So do y'all remember the talk about the Cincinnati Bengals before this season? Man, there was so much crap out there, dude. Some of it was hate. Some of it I wouldn't necessarily call hate. Just, complete and utter doubt despite everything they did in the offseason. And I get it, it's the Bengals, they haven't really earned the right over the years to have the benefit of the doubt on what they're doing. It's kind of like one of those, you gotta show me what you're doing before we believe in you kind of things. But honestly, what the Bengals have been doing right now has been building for a while. If you paid attention, you shouldn't be so surprised that they're finding success. Maybe surprised that it happened this quickly. Maybe surprised that the name Cincinnati Bengals is actually right there on the Super Bowl title, because I'm still having trouble believing that myself. But the Bengals have built good teams over the years. This isn't anything new. The problem is, the Bengals as a franchise have had a history of not actually doing anything when they build those big teams. They've only been to the Super Bowl twice, and those two Super Bowl runs were the only years that they had actually won any playoff games, except for that 1991 season that everybody talks about as being the last time that the Bengals won a playoff game before they beat the Raiders earlier this year. 3 off seasons ago, the Cincinnati Bengals moved on from 16-year head coach Marvin Lewis and decided to do a complete rebuild of the entire roster. The candidate that they chose ahead of big names at the time like Vic Fangio, Jim Caldwell, Mike McCarthy, that was a really big one, Josh McDaniels, Chuck Pagano, and Eric Bieniemy was Rams quarterback coach Zach Taylor. There were mixed reactions with this hire, just like there were with any coach, and there's always going to be with any coach. But a lot more analysis out there was negative than it was positive. There were a lot of comparisons out there, and Bengals fans in particular made these comparisons a lot, to when the Bengals hired David Shula to be the head coach back in 1992, and it was simply just because he was, young, fairly inexperienced, and, what supposedly a brilliant offensive mind, which Zach Taylor really is. David Shula was just purported to be, and then we later found out that he was not. It was kind of like they said in this article that I found from ESPN from right after they made that hire. The Bengals are starting a new era for the franchise by essentially cleaning house and going with an offensive coach after standing by Marvin Lewis, who had a defensive background for 16 seasons. It's a dramatic shift for an organization whose previous 3 coaches were all at least 45 by the time of their hiring. The Bengals named 32-year-old David Shula as the head coach in 1992, but he was fired mid-season in 1996 following 4 losing seasons. Sean Wagner-McGough of CBS wrote an article at the time grading the new head coach hirings in the NFL and wrote of bringing in Taylor, "It's easy to understand what the Bengals were going for when they zeroed in on Taylor as their preferred candidate before the Rams' postseason run even began and hired him the day after the Super Bowl. Sean McVay ended up being one of the best hirings ever, but at the time, it seemed like a reach to be hiring the youngest head coach in NFL history. Maybe Taylor, 35, follows in McVay's footsteps and leads the Bengals to glory. But it's more likely that Taylor ends up being a reach and that McVay ends up being a one-of-a-kind hiring. Taylor isn't just young, he's also incredibly inexperienced. He served as the Rams quarterbacks coach this past offseason and the assistant wide receivers coach the year prior. He's only been an NFL offensive coordinator once, and that came back in 2015 when he took over for the fired Bill Lazor in Miami. Bill Lazor reference. On an interim basis. In fairness to Taylor, he did spend a full offseason as the offensive coordinator at the University of Cincinnati, but he did not fare well in that endeavor. The Bearcats averaged 19.3 points per game under Taylor's command. As the Dolphins quarterback coach, Taylor also helped develop Ryan Tannehill, but given the trajectory of Ryan Tannehill's career, he's expected to be released this offseason, that's probably not something to tout. Now don't get me wrong, there were analysts out there who said positive things about the hiring, and even Wagner McGough, despite all those negative things that he said, ultimately graded the hiring as a B-. But there was also a lot of skepticism around the hire too during the time. The first offseason for the Bengals with Zach Taylor was rough, to say the least. People were understandably not terribly happy with the results. I mean, you had the biggest free agency news of the offseason was the fact that they re-signed Bobby Hart to a $16 million contract. A contract that was originally supposed to run through the end of this season. Obviously, that didn't happen, thank God. They also brought in John Miller, the offensive guard, to address interior issues, and new defensive coordinator and former Giants defensive backs coach Lou Anarumo brought B.W. Webb with him from the Giants, a man who averaged 54.5 in coverage as a cornerback per PFF's grading system. 54.5, y'all. That's a F. They did have a pretty good draft in the early rounds that year, but it took a couple of years for that draft to actually pay off. Jonah Williams was the first pick in that draft, and he's our best offensive lineman now, and one of the few where it makes you feel good about the future of the Bengals offensive line. Drew Sample was the next pick, and he exists. Jermaine Pratt was the third-round pick, and he has since developed into a key linebacker and made a franchise-altering interception against Derek Carr a couple weeks ago to give the Bengals their first playoff win in 31 years. Their fourth-round pick was Ryan Finley, who was terrible for most of his Bengals career, but he eventually turned into the single greatest Bengals meme of all time, and that's the greatest fourth-round pick I can imagine. After that, they had some less than impressive decisions with their remaining 6 picks, but the point is the first 4 picks all turned out pretty decent results. A year later, Pro Football Focus heavily criticized this draft because they didn't have a good rookie season, and they said it was an ugly year for the Bengals rookies. Part of that's because, well, I mean, you already know, they lost 11 games to start that 2019 season. They did beat the Jets in Week 12, though, but I think by then a lot of people were rooting for losses just so that they could get a better draft pick. Bengals fans were a mix of celebratory from people who were excited that we don't have to deal with the 0-16 stigma that the Browns had to do just a few years ago. I was one of those people who was excited about that. And then there were those who were actually rooting for 0-16, which I found infuriating at the time, but I sort of get it. If you go 0-16, you're guaranteed to get the number 1 pick, and I think they were also trying to illustrate a point, and I think quite a few of them were trying to get Zach Taylor fired. In his first year, y'all, like, how insane can you be? Bengals did have a really interesting game after that Week 12 win, though. There was Tank Bowl in Week 16 against the Miami Dolphins, and that was fascinating. Now, we're now hearing that the Miami Dolphins were intentionally trying to tank during that game, and allegedly Brian Flores was offered $100,000 per loss that season because the Dolphins just wanted to go get that number 1 draft pick. But despite the Bengals battling back and taking the game to overtime, they did manage to pull defeat from the jaws of victory, and they secured that number 1 overall pick, and they may have sent Brian Flores to his doom as the Miami Dolphins head coach. For the most part, though, everyone knew that the Cincinnati Bengals wanted Joe Burrow. There was a very strong vocal minority of Bengals fans who did want Ohio State edge rusher Chase Young because they didn't believe that the Bengals were ready for a quarterback just yet. But luckily, smarter heads prevailed on that decision, and that was despite guys like Dan Patrick, Steve Bartkowski, Zach Shamler, all insisting that Joe Burrow should pulling Eli Manning and refused to play for the Bengals that year. Even former Bengals quitter Carson Palmer joined in on the talk. In his defense, he never actually said that Joe Burrow should refuse to play for the Bengals, but he definitely made his perspective pretty obvious at the time when he went on all the talk shows telling the story about how he was so arrogant to think that he could ever turn the Cincinnati Bengals around. Never mind the fact that he actually did sort of accomplish turning the Cincinnati Bengals around, and they just happened to succumb to a whole new set of problems during his tenure, which was, failing to win in the playoffs. But that's another story for another day. Maybe I'll do a video detailing my thoughts about Carson Palmer and the way that he left the Bengals if y'all are interested. But I will say, in Carson Palmer's defense, he mentioned not signing free agents as being a big part of one of his concerns as why he felt the Bengals failed to win when it mattered during his tenure. And that's a big part of why the Bengals are doing well this year, because they've been so willing to bring in outside free agents, and they've done such a great job at bringing in some of these key free agent signings. Nobody really believed in the Bengals heading into 2020 though, and in fairness, I don't think the Bengals were quite ready to succeed just yet. They still had a lot of old Marvin Lewis holdovers who didn't buy into the system, and everybody talked about Zach Taylor losing the locker room, but it's kind of hard to gain the locker room when you fire a coach after 16 seasons. They basically had no offseason to gel together, and they did kind of start gelling around week 6, and you got to see it actually kind of start coming together for real in week 8. But then
the injury to Joe Burrow, obviously going to be the dominating topic of conversation here tonight and for the next week and months going forward. Initial reports say torn ACL.
So that was pretty much it for the rest of that season. They did win 2 more games, one of which was that absolutely legendary 27-17 upset of the Pittsburgh Steelers, sending their organization into this tailspin from which they have still seemingly yet to recover. In fact, they played better than you'd probably expect in all but 2 of those Burrow-less games in 2020. But try telling that to a Cincinnati Bengals fan or media members who believed at the time, probably fairly, that this team knows only how to crash and burn. Even considering that, the disrespect this offseason was unreal. Plenty of outlets that I really respect, including some of my favorite football YouTubers, seem to be convinced that the Bengals were not building toward anything worthwhile this season. Like my favorite football YouTuber, Tom Grossi, who said that he expected us to finish 4-13.
Let me put it this way. If Joe Burrow gets out of this season alive, you done good. The Bengals opting to draft Jamar Chase instead of a premium offensive lineman. I know they did address it a little bit during the offseason, but I still am concerned for you, Joey.
Or Zach Shamler, another guy who I really respect, who also predicted the Bengals to go 4-13.
I think Bengals fans have slightly unrealistic expectations, thinking their team is a playoff team. They're going to do all this stuff. I'm like, wow, let's slow down. You're just trying to get through a year without your quarterback getting hurt, in my opinion. I think, frankly, they got better. They added a new receiver, Jamar Chase. I don't know how much of an impact that really makes.
By the way, I do want to shout out Zach Shamler a little bit. I don't know if you're ever going to see this, Zach, but if you are listening, I just want to let you know that I respect the hell out of that video that you made where you confronted how wrong you were when you said that Joe Burrow is going to fail if he plays for the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm not going to lie. I kind of stopped listening to Strong Opinion Sports there for a little bit because I got tired of just every time I tuned in, it just was this constant barrage against my team, the Cincinnati Bengals. I don't mind opinions, but it just felt like it was just a constant barrage of negativity about the Bengals, and that's all that I got whenever they got brought up. It was just all this stuff that I knew that wasn't true about how the Bengals aren't doing anything for Joe Burrow, or how Joe Burrow was being ruined in Cincinnati because Brian Callahan was giving a tongue-in-cheek anecdote about how much Joe Burrow has progressed in the offseason, and that sometimes they have to tell him to let everybody else catch up. It was this positive, nice story that the Bengals kind of put out there about how much he's bringing to the table, but for some reason that got viewed as this negative thing. And I sort of get it now, at least I get what your perspective was, rewatching the video from my current perspective, but at the time, I just kind of felt like it was like reaching for yet another negative story about the Cincinnati Bengals for the sake of finding a negative story about the Cincinnati Bengals. By the way, you remember when you had the Bengals on your list of teams that were not going to win a Super Bowl this year, like the guaranteed teams that won't win a Super Bowl? They still have one game left to go, but they're a hell of a lot closer than most of the teams that you left off that list, man. But hey, you know what? You admitted that you were wrong. You made a whole video about it, and I really respect the fact that you did that. And, you know, I haven't really seen anybody else actually own up to it to that extent. You know, I don't really make a whole lot of money myself, but what I can do and what I will do is I encourage everybody who watches this show to go watch his show, and if you can, subscribe on Patreon, because he does things the right way, and I really respect that, and as much as I can, I'd like to support that. So when the schedule was initially released, my co-host on the Battle of Ohio podcast, Thomas, and we did a live stream where we predicted the Bengals and Browns records for the upcoming 2021 NFL season. It was terrible quality because we didn't have access to StreamYard at the time, and we were just kind of like fumbling our way through trying to get everything kind of set up and done in the right way, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend going back and rewatching it now. But, just so you know, I did predict at the time that the Cincinnati Bengals would go 11-6 this year, and that the Bengals would win their first playoff game. And I was one win off, but I was pretty damn close. So a little shout out to That Spiritual Game, who commented on my AFC Championship reaction video. He said, "Bro, you've picked against your own team so many times. No faith." And I really haven't, my man. I mean, I actually picked the Bengals. I went back and I checked. I picked the Bengals for every single live stream that I've done, except for that game against the Chiefs. And I picked the Bengals to win more games than they actually did at the beginning of the season during that live stream I just mentioned. So, how exactly do I have no faith? I mean, you know, it's fine though. Thanks for watching, seriously. No hate, I just wanted to defend myself a little bit there. But even James Rapine of the Locked On Bengals podcast and Cincinnati Bengals Talk on YouTube didn't have that much faith in the Bengals at the beginning of the offseason. He, like many people in the Bengals community, predicted that the Bengals would have kind of more of an average year and finish the year at 8-9. Surprise! They're in the Super Bowl now. Ah, that feels so good to say. So what are your thoughts, everyone? I'm sure I missed a ton of people who said very negative things about the Bengals in the offseason, but I gotta try to fit all of this into 15 to 20 minutes as much as I can. So was there anyone in particular that got on your nerves in the offseason that you want to call out? There were a lot of people, so I definitely didn't call out anywhere close to everybody. Let me know in the comments and I'll feature the best ones in my next video, like this one from Jordan Link, who said, "Man, those uniforms back then, they look like tanks." And yeah, I personally love the old style of pads where they're just absolutely massive. They look like, ogres or, like you said, tanks. I mean, it's just absolutely insane, and I miss it. But I do understand why they kind of started slimming them down, because it makes it much easier for them to perform those incredible feats of athleticism. It's part of why they have, the pass interference rules and stuff like that, to make it so hard for defensive players to stop offensive players from making these crazy, amazing catches. So I do get it. It was a real long comment, but later on in the comment, Jordan also said Two Hearts was a jam. And I'm not gonna lie, I had never even heard of that song before I looked it up for that video, and I haven't been able to get out of my damn head since. It's such a freaking earworm. It's like two hearts living in just one mind. Now, I'm not really a big fan of Phil Collins, but like I said, I cannot get it out of my damn head. So that's going to do it for this one, guys. I cannot tell you how vindicating it is to see the Cincinnati Bengals actually accomplishing the success that I knew they were capable of, and got so frustrated that very few other people could see that weren't Bengals fans. And man, if they win the Super Bowl, that recap video is going to be lit, and you're going to want to check that one out. Until then, you can always find more of what I do at KylePhelps92 on Twitter, Facebook.com/ThePhelps, my Bengals coverage at ATBNetwork.com/Cincinnati Bengals, the Battle of Ohio podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and right here if you subscribe. But thanks for watching, everyone. I'll leave y'all, as always, with a hootie!